I'm Dr. Deepali Dewan. I am a senior curator at the Royal Ontario Museum, and this is
Rahaab Allana, curator of the Al-Qazi Foundation for the Arts, based in New Delhi.
And we're standing in the exhibition between princely India and the British Raj, the photography of Raja Dayal. And the Al-Qazi collection has very generously loaned us 50 prints for the exhibition, many of which are on display on the wall here, like these ones. And I absolutely love these because these are very early prints and they're beautifully preserved. Can you talk a little bit about the Al-Qazi collection?
Sure. The Al-Qazi collection is a privately owned archive of Mr. Ibrahim Al-Qazi, who's an art collector, started as an art collector in the 1950s and 60s. He's very much still alive and lives in New Delhi. His real interest in photography began in the 1970s, just after he had been the director of the National School of Drama. So his approach to photography, as it were, came from theatre background. And of course, by living in exile in a sense, he became a non-resident Indian in the 70s and had a great passion for India and therefore collected India consistently for 30 years. And he wanted to fulfill sort of desire to know this country, but also to know it through the perspective of a kind of visual culture that was coming up over the last 150 years, which coincided with the life of, as it were, the theatre as we know it in India as well.
And so what makes the Al-Qazi collection unique?
Well, it's not only a collection of 19th century photography from India. There is a broader scope. It has works from South Asia, so Sri Lanka, Nepal, Burma, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even parts of China and Japan are represented in the collection. But I think what makes it unique is also the manner in which I think it has been studied and explored by the scholars who have done it, because they are coming from far field, in a sense. They come from the fields of sociology, anthropology, history, visual culture. I think every dimension lends a different aspect to the notion of representation, the representation of India at a time which was considered to be the time of the coming of modernity in visual culture in India. So I guess that would be one way of looking at it.
One of the strengths of the Al-Qazi collection for me has always been not necessarily the various big-name photographers from India's past that it has in its collection, which it does, fantastic examples, but really the massive amount of material of photographers who haven't been studied yet,
right,
or that we don't know anything about. And so for me, it's always been this incredible archive which has been collected in a way that's quite different than institutional archives, let's say, of colonial India or that have had some sort of state connections, or even regional archives that are connected to the government,
right,
that have very particular collecting histories. They
right,
are the archive of a certain history. The Al-Qazi collection is, in some ways, in my mind, is an alternate to that. It provides that other perspective, or many other perspectives. What do you think about that?
Well, you're certainly right. In a sense, the collection is the collection of one man, and in that sense, it has to do with his imaginary, or his sense of an imagined, of what India was to his imagination. So I would say that one of the most interesting aspects about this is we did an exhibition called The Artful Pose a few years ago at the erstwhile Victoria and Albert Museum of India, which is located in Bombay. And there we discovered the work of a man who was a pictorial photographer, Dayal, another person who practiced in Bombay in the 1890s. It was interesting to know that his work was published by Alfred Stieglitz in around 1910 in camera work that was coming out of New York.
Amazing.
So in a sense, there was international circulation and reception for work coming out of the subcontinent, as it were. But this also ties in with, I think, larger notions that a photography archive implicates, in a sense. And those would be sort of notions about the secular cult of beauty, for instance, and how this has been received over a period of time. So how can you compare a 19th century photograph to, let us say, living practices within India, or living traditions within India? And for us, it has happened ever so often through, as it were, the dimension of popular culture, something that has permeated India from the bottom up. And I think that is exactly what photography has managed to do for us over time. Though you have the works of Dayal and other state photographers who are working at for the royalty who are patronized in that way, there's so much of photography that comes up at a later period of time, inspired by that, but sort of taking it out to the public in a more democratized manner. So questions of citizenship, questions of community, these are all resonated within 19th century archive at different times for different reasons.
You know, in many ways, the projects that the Al-Qazi collection does has been mapping a whole new terrain for the study of Indian photography. It's been interesting to me that in some ways the projects that happen really circulate around India. But there's also been this increasing sense of collaboration with institutions abroad, even though the archive now is located very centrally in Delhi. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, certainly this exhibition is part of that increasing circulation abroad.
Well, I think it also emanates from the fact that, we've worked in over the last several years, ever since the archive moved to New Delhi from its two other locations in London and New York, is to try to, in a sense, empower public institutions. It's been, in a way, one of our agendas, or one of the initiatives we've tried to look at quite carefully. And there are two reasons for this. One is that photography never entered a museum or gallery space really until we started working with this archive. There was no precedent wherein photography was looked at really as an antique or an antiquity or something that could resonate with the past without becoming nostalgic, but showed this kind of, let us say, this index or this cross-networking between society, between taste and sort of cultural history. The other was, to look at institutions and these collaborations as things that will lead to the discovery of the future of photography, in a sense, with the passage of time. Can we imagine what sort of the history of the contemporary archive of photography will be? And how do you actually create an archive of contemporary practices without having solid ground to work on to begin with? So in a sense, what we might acquire now in 50, 60 or 100 years will become part of collections, but will they be vintage? Will they just be points of return? Will they really be points of initiation? Or will they be points at which history is looked upon as a disengaged, as it were, entity, but not something that was necessarily alive and, full of its own complexities? And I think exhibitions such as this one, you've researched in the last decade and put together, suggest that these practices will actually live on into contemporary practice to some extent. And certainly you can make tangible connections between, let's say, portraiture or landscape photography or architectural history and the present, which is why photography remains this compelling point of intersection. And hence this aspect of collections from the past or about the present are important for the institution of the Al-Qazi collection today.
Well, I think archives all have that potential.
Certainly.